I'm Phil Williams from the University of Pittsburgh. I've lived in Pittsburgh for almost 30 years, but I still have a Welsh accent. I'm going to talk about an area where deterrence has very little applicability, as we'll see. This is the overview, and I've got 38 slides, so I've got 30 seconds a slide. So even though I talk quickly, I'm going to work on the assumption that you can all read faster than I can talk. Okay? But I'm going to talk about migration as a wicked problem. The basic theme is we ain't seen nothing yet. It's going to get a lot worse. I'm going to give you the dimensions and the dynamics, touch a little bit, if I've got time, on the security dimension, and particularly the idea of radicalization of migrants, and then some very brief final reflections. This is actually where the wicked problem concept originated, and it was actually done by urban planners and operations research people. But it was a Berkeley seminar, and Riddle, I think it was, presented some ways in which social problems were different to technical and scientific problems. And they got on to talk about urban violence and the Watts riots and things like that, I think it was. And West Churchman actually said that's a wicked problem. And it's been developed years. And the two I mentioned on the previous slide, Horst Riddle and Mel Weber, did a piece, and this is a summary of it with some slight variations on what are the essential attributes of wicked problems. And I think one of them are multiple explanations. It's constantly changing. As you try to deal with it, it's like mercury. It's a symptom of other problems, and I'll come back to that. There are no clear solutions, right? All you can do is try to manage it and do harm reduction, in a sense. And your attempts at solutions can actually create unintended consequences, just as Chris just said, with sanctions. We actually create criminalization consequences. So those are some of the essential attributes. That's another way of thinking about it, where the stakes are high and the level of uncertainty is also very high, and that's where you have wicked problems. Different from tame problems, and different even from complex problems, even though I think wicked problems and complexity theory have a lot in common. So here are the dimensions of the refugee problem, right? It's global. Despite what we think and despite all the rhetoric, particularly coming out of Washington, most of the burden of refugees is actually undertaken by the global south, by nations in the global south. And if we think about Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, I think you can see it in all those countries. So it does put great pressure on the neighbors. But I think there's also this drive to migrate from weak, failing states or repressive states to traditional Westphalian states. And I think that's a factor to keep in mind. But that decision can be understood, I think, in terms of prospect theory. That was mentioned yesterday. When you're facing costs and risks, the costs of action are something you're willing to take. And I think that's something that's very important in driving migration. So the IOM did this report in 2018. It just gives you some of the basic figures. A lot of international migrants, many of them legitimate, of course. But that's only 3.3% of the global population. And if you actually look, you see many more people displaced internally who haven't crossed borders, right, as in the last bullet. So people actually migrate within countries rather than to countries, or more people migrate within countries. So I think that, again, helps to put things in perspective. Here is an infograph which shows the dimensions of the problem, refugees, again, compared with internally displaced people. I think the other thing that's been interested is where are these people hosted, and if you look, it's actually in the global south, over 56%. And if you look at the hosting countries, Ethiopia, Uganda, Iran, which we never think of, but obviously from Afghanistan, Lebanon, Pakistan, and then most of all Turkey. And that figure, the Turks claim, is now about 3.5 million refugees from Syria that they host. So again, the rhetoric coming out of Washington and out to parts of Europe has been that migration is very bad. And there are all sorts of dangerous social, economic, and security consequences. But if you look at this, actually we see traditionally the argument's been the opposite, right? It certainly helps those who migrate, but also is a benefit to the country in which they find themselves, benefit the destination countries, particularly if they have aging populations, because we see a much younger population in the global south, so that introduces new dynamism into the labour market and can offset some of these elderly populations. And I think that's one reason why Germany initially was so sympathetic to the refugee crisis. Some key distinctions in refugees, migrants, and you can read them. Migrants can be illegal or illegal, and sometimes I think informal is a better term than illegal. There's also a difference between human smuggling and human trafficking. All too often I've seen accounts of the migrant crisis in terms of human traffickers. And I think there are a few human traffickers who siphon people off and traffic them. Human smuggling, according to the UN, I think it's a good distinction, is actually a crime against the state, right? And the people that are willing to move. Human trafficking is a crime against the person, and it violates the person's human rights. So those are some important distinctions. So let me turn now to the dynamics. And I think what you have is a perfect storm. I've already mentioned these areas of failed governance. I'll come back to that in a moment. But that takes various forms. Some of it's driven by conflict. Some of the people we're seeing, and there's been a great deal about this, well, many people are not refugees, they're just economic migrants. Whether you're killed through starvation or killed by a bullet, you're still dead, right? And I think we need to keep that in mind. Some are from repressive regimes. We never think about Eritrea. And then you get the Russian element. I'm not sure of the answer to that question. I am sure of the consequences, whether it was deliberate or not. I think we did see the smuggling, the migration problem, the refugee problem increase enormously. So here's what it looked like in 2014. And so you see basically detected irregular or illegal migrants in a variety of countries. Okay? Here's the routes. And this really started to increase in 2015. And you get three essential routes. One from Turkey, across to Greece, and then through the Balkan route, which was traditionally a criminal smuggling route. Right? If you think about the Balkan route, that's where the drugs used to come, and still come actually, from Afghanistan down through Iran and Turkey, and then into Western Europe. That's where heroin. That's where heroin comes. Okay, so I think that's important. That's the one route. The second route, which I think is probably as more economic migrants and refugees, is the one across the central Mediterranean to Sicily and Italy. And the third one, and this is actually the one that's now growing, because the other two, for reasons I'll come on to, have been effectively stopped, is the one into Spain. And I think yesterday there were reports that an Italian ship had just taken some migrants into Spain. They wouldn't accept them in Italy. So here are the push factors. And I think there are these endemic conflict situations. We are seeing these other factors. Increasingly, we'll see climate change as a major factor in all this. And there have been some interesting projections of a number of people at risk in places like Bangladesh and India and key cities. And where you're talking 2 million now, by 2070, if not earlier, you'll be talking about 11, 15 million people in some of these cities at risk. So again, as I said, you ain't seen nothing yet. I think there's a crisis of governance. If you look around the world, I think about 25% of states are legitimate and highly effective, right? And provide good services. The rest don't. There's not a crisis of global governance. There is a global crisis of governance. And I think we're even seeing that with the rise of populism in some of the more advanced industrialized or post-industrial states. So I think there are a variety of reasons for this. One that's never talked about in security terms is neoliberalism. And neoliberalism has become the dominant philosophy in large parts of the world, which is the state should get out of the way and allow markets to operate freely. That allows governments to abdicate responsibility to their citizens. And it's no accident that in the world of neoliberalism shaped by Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, and who was the economist? Milton Friedman, that's the world of perennially weak states. That also has to do with decolonization and other factors, of course. But that is important. Many of these states fail their citizens. They failed to impose order. They failed to deal with violent criminality. So that's some of the push factors, and I think those are not going to change. This is an endemic condition. Then you have the pull factors, right? Where you have existing migrant communities. For example, a lot of Iraqis went to Sweden, and then additional Iraqis came because they already had sometimes family who had settled there. You have these transnational networks, and it's a dream, right? And it's a dream fueled by television, the internet, Facebook, and actually facilitated by social media and various forms of communication. The facilitators, we think of them as criminal organizations. I think they're better understood as informal travel agents or informal transportation companies. That's not to say many of them aren't extremely predatory. And remember, the payment is up front, so they don't care if you drown, they've already been paid. And there are no quality controls. I think that's the problem. We've also, interestingly, seen the Sicilian mafia exploit the migrant camps in Sicily, because they get about $28 a day for each migrant, but probably $25 of that is siphoned off by the Sicilian mafia. So the migrant crisis has been a boon for Italian organized crime. But this is essentially the smugglers themselves are a response to the problem. They can make high profits, and there's some figures there about Turkey, and that's the Turkish organized crime which extorts the smugglers to be able to allow them to operate. So that's a kind of second level of business. Niger, less important now, but it was very important. And what you found was that people who traditionally used contraband and smuggled contraband into Libya all of a sudden decided there was this new market, and they started to buy Toyota trucks and started, instead of moving contraband, to move people. And they are, as I say, informal transportation companies, essentially. And you can take them out, but it doesn't matter. Others will come to replace them. This was a very interesting network with an Ethiopian at the heart of it. This was a response to Lampedusa. An Italian magistrate started to say, okay, I know how to understand the mafia, so I'm going to look at these smuggling organizations in the same way. And he started doing telephone toll analysis with all the telephones that they were able to get and repair from the people who drowned or the people who were still alive. And they put together this incredible network with this figure, Umayas Gemayeth, Ethiopian, at the center of it. He actually talked about his colonels. And he had this, I think the estimate was about 30,000 people might be part of this network. So it was incredibly extensive. But again, we shouldn't just focus on the kingpins. This is a crowded and competitive market with organizations of various size and structure being involved. Ultimately, what's driving it is very similar to the drug market, right? The Prohibition-Price Dynamic. If you prohibit legal entry, which we've done in many ways, because we're still this concept of Fortress Europe, then you get this prohibition, price goes up, dynamic. So the profits are increased. The smugglers have been demonized. We see in these as a key part of the problem. They are a symptom of the problem, not a key. I mean, they obviously facilitate, but that's all they do. And they are not always bad. And Mark Shaw, who heads the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, says, look, smugglers can often be guides and protectors. And I think you get good and bad smugglers within this, right? And Tuesday Rotano, who's written a great book on this, has really been very critical of border controls, because all we're doing is giving more lucrative markets to the smugglers. So inhibitors, very few. Right, back to prospect theory. People are willing, these are the people who die on the way. And you can see how dangerous the Mediterranean is, right? Even though the problem's diminished, still very dangerous. Still by far the most dangerous of the routes. The interesting thing about that boat is not one person on it has been deterred. Right? They have all come from something that's so bad they are willing to risk crossing the Mediterranean. So there are a lot of considerations, right? How do we make the trade-offs between humanitarianism and security? How do we integrate new migrants? Particularly when you have an extreme right. This is the Daily Express. the xenophobia is not just confined to the US. See, and that was done by the Leeds Asylum Seeker Support Network. The EU response, policy divergences we've seen, particularly after Cologne. They actually ease after Cologne. But this is a wicked problem, and you've got a wicked policy process because you have 26 different countries with different preferences on this. Partly a matter of capacity. Some states just can't accommodate migrants. You have and then the other danger, right, is the harm reduction strategy. Operation Mare Nostrum, where you're picking up the migrants, encourages more. It's a moral hazard. So you also have tensions between the NGOs, but we've had two deals essentially that have reduced the problem temporarily. The first one was the deal with Turkey, and there are the elements of it. So, and there's been some interesting arguments about the second $3 billion, but I think they finally agreed on that. But the visa liberalization has not gone nearly as far as was expected. So that hasn't been entirely without its problems. And the Turks say we now doing, as I said, 3.5. We now have 3.5 million refugees. But that's what happened as a result of that agreement, right? I mean, you see that agreement, and then you see the incredible fall off, right, in migrants coming from Greece. So it starts to go in 16 and 17, the problem becomes an Italian problem. And what you have is a deal then with the Government of National Accord in Libya in February 17. It's endorsed by the EU, but essentially it goes back to the deal with Gaddafi that the Italians had when Gaddafi was still in power. And basically say, you deal with the problem for us, and we'll pay you. We'll strengthen your Coast Guard, and we'll give money to the militias. And a lot of the militia, there are two kinds of militias now. There are smuggling militias, and there are anti-smuggling militias. But they're both militias, right? We haven't changed anything like that. So you've got EU development support we talked about, but it basically is in return for the criminalization of human smuggling in Nigeria. A lot of critiques. EU, NGOs have been very critical of the problems that migrants now face when they're stuck in Libya. Rotano and others have argued that also supporting the militias makes the task of forming a solid, respectable, effective, legitimate central government much more difficult. So that's the critique. Here's the update. Right, interesting. We're still on course much for the same as 2017, but we've also seen, interestingly, we've also seen more arriving in Spain. So here's a security dimension very quickly. To what extent do you have to worry about ISIS members among the refugees? Are migrants likely to become radicalized? And I think there are some dangers, but also dangers to them. It's interestingly, we always think of increasingly now we think of migrants as criminals. They are much more likely to be victims of crime than perpetrators of crime. And a lot of good criminology studies have proven that, including one recently in Texas, interestingly. They can form gangs. The Black Axe and the Vikings is actually a Nigerian organized crime gang, operating in Sicily and paying tribute and a share of its profits from human trafficking and control of prostitution to the Sicilian mafia. I think if you think about the radicalization process, one of the things that AQ did was a grievance narrative, right? And the term grievance narrative is from a book about Muhammad Ali. He had a grievance narrative that he developed all the time. ISIS went further with an empowerment narrative, and I think both, in a sense, were able to recruit terrorists and ISIS more effectively because not only was there grievance, there was a sense of empowerment, particularly with the caliphate. Here's another way of seeing it, and this is courtesy of my friend Tom Makaitis. Right, and you get disaffected minorities who can become violent in a non-political way or in a very political way. So final reflections, quick fixes, that's all we have so far. They're not going to work. The problem's going to get worse. We need to be thinking about this long term because what we've seen is really a trickle, and we're going to see a massive stream, a flood in the future. And just think about it. Just think about if Egypt becomes unstable, or if Iran becomes unstable. Think about the fragility of the countries which are hosting many of these. So this is basically the smuggling business of the 21st century. And I would argue that governments need to regularize and liberalize, actually, their immigration procedures and make them much more streamlined, because otherwise this problem is going to become even worse than it is already. Thank you very much for listening.